Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. COVID-19 vaccines were given to tens of thousands of people in early clinical trials and to hundreds of millions of Americans since. Top health experts agree that COVID-19 vaccines are safe, effective, and trusted. Visit vaccinate.wv.gov or contact your local health department.
All right, so September. It's snuck up on us once again, and everyone's probably in the heat of harvest season. And so with that, we wanted to go over some tips and tricks for making your harvest better as far as maintaining its shelf life and storage abilities by harvesting it in the best way possible. We also wanted to talk about curing, which is a step that if you don't do, then you are not going to have a very good shelf life on your product.
Yeah, the curing process can even be done out in the field if the conditions are right. It's almost like a hardening step for shelf life. A lot of times it almost kind of happens on its own, and there are things that will prevent the hardening of the vegetable or the fruit. But we'll kind of go over some examples and go over some different conditions that are more preferable to having that kind of chemistry occur. And then your products will be prolonged as far as the shelf life goes. But let's back up one step now. Sometimes we'll have some kind of infection in the plants and we have some disease, some pathogens, and we have to take some steps in mitigating that problem. But a very important step that I don't think we normally talk about too much is the post-harvest handling and sanitation, which then will lead to the curing, which is kind of the step that will increase the shelf life of a product. But handling of the produce after harvest is very important because at that point, it gets touched and moved in so many directions that a lot of food safety problems can occur.
Yeah, most definitely. And food safety is a very big issue right now. And if you haven't had the opportunity to take our grower safety training, then I highly recommend it. It's a day-long training, but it is very informative and it can help you make sure that you're getting the safest product to market. And so, when you're looking at your post-harvest handling, the main objectives here are going to be to maintain the quality of the produce that you're harvesting, to reduce the losses from harvest to consumption, so make it last longer, and then also, of course, food safety. And so by making sure that you are increasing your shelf life, that's going to give you access to more markets. And the first thing a lot of people think about when they think about extending the shelf life of a product is cooling the produce. So getting that field heat off. And that is a great way because what it does is it basically stops the product from ripening as quickly. The produce is still alive, and so it is going to still continue to grow a little bit as it sits there.
Not grow, but ripen.
But if you can slow that process down by getting the heat off of it, then that is going to extend your shelf life there. So some of the most common ways to get heat off are to, one, just put it in the shade, get it out of the sun. Number two is to take it into a refrigerated room, so a cool lot or a root cellar or a refrigerated room to help get that field heat off by spreading your vegetables out a little bit, harvesting them in smaller containers to allow for that heat to get out more quickly. And then there's also, of course, using ice. Now, ice isn't used too much around here. It's most common on things like broccoli, things that are really thick and will hold that heat longer. But you have to remember, anytime you're using any water spray or dunks or ice, that water has to be potable. And if you're using a dunk to take the heat off of your lettuce or your tomatoes or whatever, you have to recognize that when that fruit or produce is hot, it's got all of its pores open, right? And if you drop it into an icy cold bath, well, it's going to do the same thing you or I would do if we were dropped into an icy cold bath. And it's going to shrink up real fast, right? And in that process of closing all those pores and shrinking up against itself, it's actually going to pull in some of the water that's around it into its cells. And so this is most common in areas where you have a cut or a broken area on the plant. So that could be where, so let's say the tomato was attached to the vine. That is an opening into the fruit, that spot where it was attached. And so that is a prime location for any pathogens that are in the water or ice to go into your fruit. And they've actually done a lot of really interesting studies where they've put dye in the water and put the warm fruit in that cold water. And it shows how far in that water actually gets into your produce. And so no longer is it just the outside of your produce that could be contaminated with a food safety pathogen like E. coli or something like that, but it's actually down inside now because you have, in making that temperature shift so severe, you have actually allowed that pathogen into the produce. So you want to make sure that when you're using a dunk or an ice bath, that water or ice is made of potable water. It's got to be potable, which means that there is zero E. coli or coliform bacteria in that water.
Let's call it treated water or drinking water.
Yeah, that works too. And so your ice has to be potable, made out of potable water. And any dunks that you're using, basically anything you use after harvest or during harvest has to be potable. So you can get away with what's called agricultural water ahead of time, as long as you're following the food safety regulations of allowing dry out times and making sure that you're monitoring counts and things like that. But that's a whole nother show. For this, we want to make sure anything from harvest onward has to be potable.
Yeah, and let's back up a little bit. So that cold shock that you're talking about, you can mitigate these things also by making sure that you're not harvesting the produce at the peak heat times of the day, because the plants are responding to the environment. And when the environment's hot, that fruit is also hot. So harvesting at a time when your fruit and vegetables are at its hottest temperatures are really just going to exaggerate that transition from the hot temperatures to more of a cooling effect for storage and curing down the road. So one of the things you can do when you are doing this stuff, for one thing, make sure that your hands are clean. Make sure that the places you're putting your products are clean. But also try to do things so that you are mitigating those heat extremes. So you're not going from a 95-degree hot summer, we'll say early fall afternoon, to a water bath that's going to be right at 32 degrees. The shorter that jump is, the less shock your produce is going to endure, and the less likely you'll have that infiltration of the whatever's touching on the outside of that produce being injected in the inside, which could be bad stuff. It could make somebody sick. That would be the worst case scenario, but it could also cause problems with an infection, and then cause the shelf life to go down, maturation to be accelerated, and then the product won't keep as long. So keep your hands clean, keep your containers clean, and try to mitigate that shock effect from super hot to super cold the best you can, whether that will be early in the day, overcast skies, maybe more temperate days of harvesting might also be okay.
If nature wants to cooperate, yeah. Yeah, those are all great points. And reducing the potential for contamination by keeping your hands and harvesting equipment clean, obviously, are going to go a long way. But also, you'll need to monitor your dunk water, and you'll want to check it every so often to make sure, like if you're using a sanitizer in that water, that your pH is right, your temperature is right, and that your sanitizer is at their correct concentration. And most sanitizers have a little fancy strip you can use to keep monitoring that. But also, just pay attention to the water. If it looks mucky and dirty and cloudy, then your sanitizer is not going to be able to do as good of a job as if the water is clear. So using a Secchi disc, or, just making a dark spot on your bottom of your sink, and if you can't see that line, it's time to change the water. Do whatever works for you. Make sure that there is something that you can use to monitor that. And I also wanted to talk about the temperature of your wash water. So let's just say that you're not trying to cool your produce with the water, you're just trying to clean your produce. It's recommended that your wash water should actually be 10 degrees warmer than your produce. And so you want to chill your produce before you wash it. And I know that seems kind of counterintuitive because you want to bring it in from the field, wash it, and then put it in the cooler. But you actually want to do it the other way. You want to put it in the cooler, get it down to temperature, then you want to wash it, because then you don't have that cold shock that we were talking about that'll draw those pathogens potentially into the produce. You want to have your wash water be warmer. If you are not going to want to test your water in dunk bath, or you're not going to try to have that water warmer, then always use a spray so that you're using single-use water straight out of the faucet. That spray off can help reduce the amount of contaminants that are on that produce. It can lower the temperature of the produce, but you don't have to worry so much about whether or not you're contaminating the produce or spreading contamination from one article of produce to all the rest of them. And that's the danger with dunk tanks, really. It's not that they're inherently bad. It's just that if you're not monitoring that water, then you can get your contamination from one article of your produce, and it can spread it to all the rest of them. And so instead of having one thing, you have everything that's no longer saleable. So you want to watch that.
Yeah, and I just kind of want to contrast something. We did start the show off by talking about curing and what that means, and then we went into the harvesting process and the washing. But there are things that you cure out in the field. Let's take, for instance, pumpkins and squash, right? It's about that season. A lot of pumpkins are, if not ready now, they're going to be ready in the next month. Pumpkins and squash are going to be done curing when nicks and small cuts are scabbed over. So what Karen was saying about the tomato, right? The point of attachment to the plant and the fruit, that is an open pathway that the sugars then can flow into that fruit, into that sink. And for something like pumpkins and squash and all cucurbits, curing is going to be done when the nicks and small cuts are scabbed over. So when you're talking about something like curing squash and pumpkins, those are going to be able to be done out in the field. In this case, once you remove the fruit from the vine, now you're going to do what's called field curing. And what's going on there is you're giving that fruit, that pumpkin, that squash, whatever it is, a chance to harden and close off those scabs, and then its shelf life be increased because it's going to be hardened up and impermeable to a lot of the environmental moisture, pathogens, whatever the case may be. So field curing can be done as long as it's not going to rain in the forecast. So if you have something like a week's worth, maybe 4 to 7 days worth of days that it's not going to rain, or hopefully you predict that it's not going to rain, or to your best guess it's not going to rain, because nothing's a guarantee. And then you have warm days that you can harvest the pumpkins, set them out in the field. Some people like to put something under the pumpkin so they don't have that soil contact. And what you're doing is you're allowing that pumpkin to cure, to start sealing those nicks and cuts, and then to scab over any cuts that happened in the skin of the fruit. That'll take anywhere from 4 to 7 days. And then the washing and the cleaning steps would kind of follow suit afterwards. But not everything has to lead the same sequence of events. Some things have to be cured inside.
Right.
And we'll talk about those in a minute. But there are things that you can cure out in the field. And as a rule of thumb, these are going to be things that are already exposed to light. They're already exposed to the environment. So one of the ways to start that curing process is to stop its growth. And that would be by removing it from the vine, from the plant, allowing it to be cut off from that source of nutrients. And then the fruit can harden itself up. But again, the principles are there. You don't want an infection to happen during that time. So if it's constantly raining when that pumpkin is off the vine, now you're just exposing it to wet, to dirt, to pathogens, and you can have a chance of infiltration of those pathogens and a contamination. Then it'll never cure right because it's already infected. So it's very important that when you're thinking about field curing, that you're going to harvest at a point in time when things are going to be nice and dry out in the field. A lot of people, like I said, do move them off the field so that they're standing on something dry, on tarps or something that's not soil, and it doesn't harbor a whole lot of pathogens. But in this case, it's just a little bit different from having to clean it and then going to cure it secondly.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about the temperature, the fall is actually great for curing these winter or squash products because you're looking at a desired temperature of like 80, 85 degrees, which is typically what we're seeing in the fall. But you also are looking for that high humidity. You're looking at like 90% humidity, which again is like our fall. So we're doing pretty good there. As long as you can miss that rain, you'll be all right. Now, before we go out of squash, I do want to say there is an exception to this, and that is acorn squash. So, acorn squash, you should store it at 45 degrees after the harvest without curing it, because curing acorn squash actually makes it kind of stringy. So, if you're having it for eating, you don't want to cure it, but if you want it for decoration, then curing it's fine. Keep in mind when you are harvesting your acorn squash what your consumer wants it for. You know, very few people these days actually eat acorn squash. I think it's a shame because it's delicious, but do know your market and know your audience. And if they want it to sit on their porch or on their dining room table for months, then yeah, you want to sell them a cured one. But if they want to cook it for dinner, then maybe one that has been stored cool in a cooler place would be better.
I love how there's always an exception, Karen.
There's always an exception.
And the great thing is about working with somebody is that usually one or the other kind of knows it. So and they'll throw it right in there, and that's great information. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And there are very specific things, the temperature ranges, the humidity that you have to look for, how much time it has to be out there. I did say 4 to 7, but sometimes it's 7 to 10 days, depending on the specific type of cucurbit that you're talking about. And like Karen said, there are exceptions that you don't want hot, you want cool. It's always interesting to look at when you're curing something. If you have produce, for instance, onions and garlic that grow underground, right? So these things don't see the light of day, literally. They're underground. They have leaves that are producing the metabolites that give it that garlic flavor, the onion flavor flowing it down to the bulb. And onions and garlic mature underground. So when you're talking about curing something like onion and garlic that have those cloves, you have to understand they thrive in that darkness. At least that part of the plant thrives in darkness. So when you're curing something like that, as an additional step to the curing process, you have to make sure that you also put it in darkness. Because what happens with plant tissue is once plant tissue is exposed to light, it likes to green up. And when it greens up, a lot of the chemistry in that part of the plant also changes. So, one important thing to note with onions and garlic is that you're going to harvest those. Well, let's talk about garlic specifically. When 50% of the garlic leaves are dead, are a great time to harvest those. And then when you're going to cure those, so you're going to clean them out because those are going to be full of dirt. And then you're going to put them in a dark room that's dry, and you're going to hang them by the necks about 3 to 4 weeks of curing. And those have to be cured, otherwise they won't keep at all. With garlic specifically, it's very important to make sure that you are harvesting those not too early and not too late, because of the skin around the cloves will either be too loose or too tight, and then you won't get a very good curing process. So we're typically looking at about 50% of the leaves dying before you harvest those, and then they have to be cured in the darkness. The temperature range for those 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit and 70% relative humidity.
And with garlic and onions, it's very important that you maintain good airflow. And really, for any of the crops we're going to be talking about, good airflow is really going to be critical because it helps to keep the moisture from collecting on them if it's really humid, and it also helps to get the moisture out of the crop.
All right.
So do we want to move on to potatoes?
We can. Yeah.
All right. So with potatoes also like to be in the dark, right? But you need to know that potatoes, when they're exposed to the sunlight, will develop that solenic acid, which is poisonous, and that's when they turn green. So you don't want green potatoes. So when you harvest your potatoes, you've got to get them someplace dark for their curing process. Now, it's nice because with your potatoes, they actually don't like it super hot. So you can pretty easily sneak them down into your cellar or a cool basement and cure them there. Because as long as you have a relative humidity that's pretty high, they don't need a whole lot of temperature. So 59 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit will make your potatoes happy, which is about the temperature of a normal basement in this part of the country. So as long as you can maintain that humidity, which is the tricky part, you can cure those potatoes in the basement. Now, it's also important to know that potatoes and sweet potatoes are not related and should not be dealt with in the same way. So sweet potatoes, they want it hot. They want it 86 to 90 degrees, just like your garlic and your winter squashes. They want it hot. So 86 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit for your sweet potatoes with an 85 to 90% humidity. They're not as particular about being in the dark as our other root crops. As we said earlier, there's always an exception. So you can actually, they've found that if you have a high tunnel that's done with its season, because now it's just way too hot in a high tunnel because it'll bake everything, you can actually put your sweet potatoes in there to cure and utilize that space while you're not growing any crops in there. And so that's a great option for sweet potatoes because they do need that moderately high humidity and that nice, warm, toasty time. And it's going to take sweet potatoes 4 to 7 days to cure, whereas your Irish potatoes or your white potatoes are going to be 5 to 10 days.
Yeah, and don't forget that you have to keep those in the dark. I know, Karen, I know you were talking about the regular potatoes, but I want to say the sweet potatoes will have the same principle, that it might not create a toxin like the solanaceae. What's that? Salicylate acid? What would you say it was?
Solenic
acid. Thank you. But it's going to end up greening, and that's going to again change that chemistry. So I would say if you are using a tunnel as a humidification agent, keep the sweet potato or the potato that you're using off the ground somehow, like put a tarp down and then kind of cover that so that you don't have a lot of light exposure either, because I don't think that's going to be beneficial to the curing process when we're talking about a tuber.
Yeah, putting some shade cloth on the high tunnel could be beneficial for that. You're going to need to have shade cloth to keep it under 100 degrees anyway, so you're going to be blocking out some of your light. But I do want to say with sweet potatoes, once you've cured them, they should always be above 50 degrees. They are not a refrigeratable or a cooler crop. They need to be fairly warm for a good storage life, and their storage life can be up to 4 months. Whereas with your Irish or white potatoes, you're looking at a cooler storage temperature. But again, you don't need to put them in your refrigerator, just some cold storage. If you have a cool bot or something like that, that would be beneficial for regular potatoes. But you're going to treat your sweet potatoes sort of like your tomatoes and never put them in the refrigerator. Now, with any crop that you're harvesting and that you're trying to keep with a shelf life, the most important thing you need to do is pick it at the proper maturity and make sure that you are not trying to store any produce that's damaged, bruised, cut, or anything like that. You want it to be the perfect produce. So if you have something that's bruised, maybe has a mark on it where an insect gouged it or something, your fingernail stabbed it, use that stuff now. Sell that now, use it for a canning product or whatever, but you don't want to try to store that because that opening is going to, like Dan was saying way back in the beginning of the show, any opening is going to allow for pathogens and decay to get in. So do be careful of that.
That's right. And what the old saying, one bad apple spoils the bunch. Even though in this example, apples aren't actively growing and they're off the tree, as fruits, specifically, we're talking about fruits, as fruits ripen, they do produce a ripening hormone that then ripens everything around them. So when you have a nick, an infection, it just causes the plant to mature faster. And if you have something like that mixed in with your good stuff, it's going to cause it to over ripen and everything's going to go to spoil very quickly.
Right. So that just leads us to our final comment today of make sure after you have stored it and you've done everything right, that you do go back in and you check it at least weekly to make sure that something hasn't gotten past you, that something isn't starting to decay, that it's going to be emitting more of that ethanol, that ripening agent. Make sure that you get those out of there and keep the rest of the crops stored properly.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.